Thank you, Ike. When you're talking about exports, it reminded me, at least back when we had the inversion fights in the 2000s, that at that point in time, and I assume it must be similar, 1/4 of U.S. exports are actually sales from American companies to their foreign subsidiaries. So it does make a big difference to jobs and exports in America to have American companies competing for market share abroad. I want to go ahead and put all this now in context and wrap it up. Inversions, as I indicated, were big last decade. And then Congress passed some legislation that I think fairly can only be called financial protectionism or fiscal protectionism. That sort of slowed it down. But as David indicated, you can't completely stop inversions so long as you have free movement of capital, so long as you have you don't put huge barriers in terms of companies operating around the world. And so now inversions have become a big issue again because of cross-border mergers. And when you have these cross-border mergers, in almost every single case, it makes sense for the reasons that have already been discussed for these inversions to take place with the foreign company becoming the official parent and the U.S. company becoming the subsidiary, even though in many cases, indeed most cases, the headquarters still stays in the United States. But let's go ahead and look at a couple of slides that'll put all this in context. This shows the wave of inversions last decade and now the wave of inversions today. Here's a different look at it. The numbers aren't the same. This is from the Democratic staff of the House Ways and Means Committee showing how inversions have been taking off. So whichever set of numbers you believe, it's clear that a lot of them are happening. And the question is why? Well, taxes are a dominant factor. It doesn't mean the only factor. It could very well be that Tim Hortons and Burger King would have economic reasons to merge regardless of tax codes, but there's no doubt about it that the investors at Burger King, the shareholders, are looking at this and saying, we'll have a more profitable company if we can escape the worldwide tax system of the United States. And indeed, as David mentioned, we have the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world. Some people say the entire world, depending on how you count a few countries. But the real problem is not just that we have the high tax rate, we have the system of worldwide taxation, which is a second layer of tax imposed on American companies for the income they earn abroad. Because never forget that if you're an American company and you're earning money in some place like Switzerland, you're already paying Swiss corporate income tax. So the question is, does it make sense to then force the company to declare that income a second time to the IRS and pay tax on it? Now, of course, we do have deferral, which at least allows them to postpone that, but at the cost of locking up their capital and keeping it overseas. Here's a map showing some major countries and their corporate tax rates. Who would have thought the United States would have a higher corporate tax rate even than France? And you look at some of our major competitors, and their corporate tax rates are about half our level. As a matter of fact, if you look at this chart that our friends from the Tax Foundation put together, you can see that about 30 years ago, corporate tax rates were very high. But then we entered a very virtuous cycle of tax competition. The U.S. actually took the lead by lowering our corporate tax rate during the Reagan years. Other countries caught up, and then they passed us. So our corporate tax rate has stayed relatively high, but look what's happened to the average of corporate tax rates for other industrialized countries. It says 25.1. They're actually down with the latest data to closer to 24%. So other countries are reacting to globalization. They're making sensible changes to make their business environments more friendly. The United States is sitting still. Now, maybe we could have sat still in 1986 when we took a lead, but then other people continued to do the right thing. And now we're in trouble. Here's a map showing high corporate tax rate. You don't want to be dark colored in this map. The United States is dark colored, as you can see. But the real key, as I said before, it's not just the high rate, it's the worldwide taxation. Countries around the world have not only been lowering their corporate tax rates, they've been moving in the direction of territorial taxation. Now, to be perfectly honest, there are probably very few pure worldwide tax systems. Even the U.S. isn't pure worldwide since we have deferral. And among the countries that are territorial, oftentimes they do have a few exemptions. So it's more like a continuum. But on that continuum, with really bad policy being pure worldwide taxation, the U.S. is farthest in that wrong direction. Here's a chart you won't be able to remotely understand, but it was a study looking at corporate tax systems around the world and ranking them on how business-friendly they were, how investor-friendly they were. 100 countries, the United States came in 94th. Now, this didn't just look at the tax rate. It didn't just look at worldwide taxation. It also looked at things like depreciation policy. But again, you don't need to even be able to read any of the numbers. Just understand that being 94th out of 100 is not a good place to be on that kind of chart. And if you look just at the countries that have some form of worldwide taxation, you see that the United States stands out for having an extraordinarily high corporate tax rate. And you'll also notice that there really aren't any major countries. As David said, we're the only major country that has worldwide taxation. So now let's sort of ask ourselves the fundamental question, the whole purpose of this panel today. What are the reasons to block inversions? Well, the good reasons, I'm going to postulate 0. What are the bad reasons? Well, desire for more revenue, financial protectionism, political demagoguery, and the false canard that it keeps jobs in America. And let's sort of look at this. Here's a chart put together by some people who don't like inversions, and it makes it seem like, oh my God, we have this giant problem. Look at this, $19.5 billion that could be lost. Well, okay, wait, what's a 10-year number? What are corporate tax revenues over 10 years? Well, here's a chart showing projections from the Congressional Budget Office of corporate tax revenue over the next 10 years. And then the line, the little bar that you can't even really see is the amount of money that is, quote, lost to inversions. And I actually think if you didn't do static revenue scoring, you did dynamic revenue scoring, you would actually see, you wouldn't even see that tiny, tiny sliver of revenue compared to the $4.5 trillion, that $19.5 billion wouldn't even exist. Now, here's something that I think is very important. Here's another chart from our friends at the Tax Foundation. People don't understand that American companies pay a lot of tax, over $100 billion of tax to foreign governments. So when demagogues are saying, oh, if this company inverts, they're not going to pay tax, that's wrong. They pay a lot of tax on their overseas operations to foreign governments. And guess what? Whether you invert or whether you don't invert, whether you're an American domiciled company or a foreign domiciled company, if you earn income in the United States, you are going to be subject to the American corporate income tax. All that happens with an inversion is that foreign source income is no longer subject to double taxation by the United States government. And let's finally address the runaway plant myth, because some people say, oh, this is costing jobs. Well, no, it's not, because the headquarters stays in America, the operations stay in America. All that happens is that you're taking your charter out of a filing cabinet in some place like Delaware, and you're putting it in a cabinet. Of course, this all happens now electronically. There are no actual cabinets with charters, I assume, anymore, but maybe David knows these things since he's a lawyer. Not a bad guy, even though he's a lawyer. But anyhow, all that happens is that the charter goes from an electronic filing cabinet in Delaware to an electronic filing cabinet in someplace like London. Now, in the long run, though, as Ike was suggesting, if we have a very high corporate tax rate, guess what? There will be economic reasons for jobs and investment to go to other countries. And that would be true whether inversions exist or whether they don't. That is a problem we have to address. The high corporate tax rate combined with worldwide taxation, that's what creates the inversion problem, which is just a small slice of the overall challenge that we face. So here are a couple of points to close with. Inversions are not tax evasion. It's not cheating at all. It's simply dealing with the law as it is, a very flawed law, and companies trying to do their fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, workers, and consumers, given the very bad state of play that they are faced with by the political decisions here in Washington. And again, companies, regardless of where they are based, pay tax on their U.S. source income. Inversions simply deal with avoiding the extra layer of tax for U.S.-based companies. Morally speaking, an inversion is no different from me deciding I work in Washington, I could live in Maryland, D.C., or Virginia. Guess what? I chose to live in Virginia because my taxes are marginally lower. Am I wrong? Am I immoral for doing that? I suppose if I was a Maryland politician, I would say I was wrong and immoral. But I simply made a sensible decision based on my household, just like companies make sensible decisions for their shareholders, workers, and consumers. Now, the Obama administration doesn't seem to understand this at all. You may remember from the 2008 campaign, Obama was talking about bad companies that were registered in Ugland House in the Cayman Islands. And he said it must have been either the biggest building in the world or the biggest tax scam in the world because there are 12,000 of these companies, he said. Well, he was actually wrong. There were 18,000 companies, but he was within 50% of the right answer. For a politician, that's pretty good. But is there something wrong about 18,000 companies being registered at this one building in the Cayman Islands? Well, I wish he had asked his vice president, because his vice president used to be a senator from Delaware. Now, here's a building in Delaware. Unlike Ugland House, which I think is 5 stories tall, this building is 2 stories tall. How many companies are registered in this building in Delaware? 221,000. I actually have a company in this building, it turns out. I didn't even know it until I looked up the address on some corporate documents. But the key point to understand is that companies choose a place of domicile for legal registration purposes on the quality of the corporate and business law and tax law. It has nothing to do with where their headquarters are. There obviously are not 221,000 companies operating inside that building in Delaware, unless it has like 150 stories underground, and I'm pretty sure it doesn't. Where a company operates fundamentally is going to be on the basis of economic factors, market access, and things like that. Where they choose to domicile is a function of good business, corporate, and tax law, sound and honest courts, and things like that. And unfortunately, the politicians don't seem to appreciate that. Instead, they prefer to demagogue the issue. Thank you very much. We'll be happy to answer questions until we get close to 1 o'clock.